At the beginning of the 17th century, the Romanov dynasty came to power in Russia. After destroying their political opponents, the new rulers of Russia set out to destroy the history and ancient culture of the Russian people. A wave of demolitions swept across the country, resulting in the irretrievable loss of most of the historical monuments of the pre-Romanov era. This film will tell the story of some of them. It is known that architectural monuments contain a lot of information about the era to which they belong. Sometimes the decorations of palaces and temples can tell us more about the time of their creation than chronicles and government documents. The architecture of the 15th–17th centuries contained the authentic history of the old Russian Empire. It is not surprising that with the arrival of the Romanovs to power, their fate was sealed. In the center of Moscow's Kremlin stand three famous cathedrals: the Assumption, Archangel, and Annunciation cathedrals. It is believed that the Assumption Cathedral was built during the reign of Ivan III in the second half of the 15th century. From that time on, it became the main cathedral of the Russian Empire and always received special attention. In 1481, the best painter of that time, Dionysius, together with his team, painted a three-tiered iconostasis and several large icons in the cathedral. And at the beginning of the 16th century, it was adorned with frescoes. However, if you visit this majestic cathedral today, you won't see any of it. This is because in the middle of the 17th century, the ancient icons were replaced with new ones, and the beautiful frescoes by Dionysius were completely destroyed. According to the official version, the ancient icons and frescoes were greatly deteriorated, so they had to be replaced with new ones. But they were only about 150 years old. Why have they fallen into disrepair in such a short time? And this was not only the case with the Assumption Cathedral. At around the same time, by the order of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, all the wall paintings in the Archangel Cathedral of the Kremlin were destroyed. They too were allegedly too old and unusable. Interestingly, frescoes painted in the 17th century, that is, already during the Romanovs' reign, were not destroyed after 100, 200, or even 300 years. Why, then, in the 17th century, was there a need to destroy frescoes that were relatively new, painted by the best icon painters of the 16th century? Moreover, the frescoes were deliberately destroyed. If they wanted to cover the walls of the cathedrals with new frescoes for some reason, why didn't they just paint over the old ones, as was done, for example, in the Annunciation Cathedral of the Kremlin? No, a huge amount of work was done specifically to remove the plaster from the entire surface of the walls and vaults of the Assumption and Archangel cathedrals. Was it because the Romanovs wanted to destroy these images forever? Today, specialists claim that before the destruction of the frescoes, a description of the original compositions was made. Supposedly, this helped to preserve the conceptual idea and compositional scheme of the 16th century paintings. The Romanovs could have preserved the composition. It was not the issue. But what was specifically depicted on the destroyed frescoes, we will never know for sure. Unfortunately, ancient frescoes were destroyed not only in the Kremlin cathedrals. This is the Savior Cathedral of the Andronikov Monastery of the Savior in Moscow. It was painted by Andrei Rublev himself. But only small fragments of the original frescoes on the slopes of the altar windows are all that remains of the former splendor of the cathedral.
By order of the Romanovs, all the frescoes of the Andronikov Monastery and its main cathedral were barbarously destroyed. Moreover, they were destroyed so barbarously that to this day, deep grooves from chisels and drills used to chip off priceless ancient Russian images are visible on the tiles. It is remarkable that the Romanovs did not even order these frescoes to be painted anew over with new frescoes. These walls have remained bare to this day. All of this shows some contempt, perhaps even with shades of mockery, on the part of the Romanovs towards ancient Russian history. They not only destroyed old gravestones, old temples, and old frescoes, but also deliberately left bare and disfigured walls in their place.
And this is the Cathedral of the Nativity of the Mother of God in the Luzhetsky Man's Monastery. Once upon a time, unique frescoes also adorned the walls of this cathedral, but they were destroyed in the 17th century.
It is believed that there were never any frescoes there. However, recently when the layer of soil was removed in this monastery down to the 17th century layer, the surface of the earth from the second half of the 17th century was exposed. The destroyed frescoes were simply lying in a heap against the monastery wall. We saw them ourselves.
Later, the Romanovs declared both the Polish-Lithuanian invaders and the Napoleonic occupiers to be responsible for the destruction of ancient Russian monuments. And terrible fires periodically occurred in Russia that miraculously destroyed exactly what hindered the Romanovs from promoting their version of Russian history. It is known that Peter the Great and his entourage did not like Moscow. The French courtier Lebua wrote that at the court of Peter the Great, the words Muscovite and Moscovia were deeply offensive. It is clear that deep political twilight must have descended upon Moscow, and especially the Moscow Kremlin. With the onset of the 18th century, the Kremlin palace was abandoned. However, the Romanovs didn't just doom the ancient Russian Kremlin to neglect and gradual destruction. They decided to mock the ancient Russian holy sites. For example, in the Palace of the Facets they began to hold weddings for jesters. Celebrations and rituals that were impossible before were held within the ancient walls. Unique ancient frescoes were covered with lime. Instead of the previous solemn ambassadorial receptions, comedies and dialegias were played out here. Dialegias were plays in which there was no dramatic action, only conversations justifying the actions of the sovereign and ridiculing his enemies, supporters of the old believers and therefore ignorance. For example, one such dialegia was arranged in 1702 on the occasion of the wedding of the jester Filat Shonsky. The dilapidation of some of the buildings in the Kremlin Palace also occurred because at the behest of Peter, various collegiate bodies, chancelleries, and commissions were located there. Almost every collegiate organ moved to the Kremlin not only with its archives, officials, guards, and various petitioners, but also transported its prisoners, who lived for months, and sometimes years, in the stone palace cellars. All this certainly multiplied the dirt that prematurely destroyed the ancient buildings. The idea of placing colonies of convicts and stables in the very heart of the former empire carried an unconditional ideological character. By smearing the former symbols and shrines of the horde with dirt and horse manure, the new authorities vividly showed the people, who was now the master of conquered Russia. But even this was not enough for the new rulers. A tavern was opened in the Kremlin. It was located under the hill near the Tainitsky gates. Drunken and reckless songs and cries of homeless resounded above the silent ancient cathedrals. From time to time, fights and stabbings broke out there. Law-abiding citizens shied away and avoided the now gloomy Kremlin. With each passing year, the Moscow Kremlin was being destroyed more and more. After a decade of destruction, the Romanov administrators drew up an estimate of the expenses required for its restoration. It became clear that a considerable sum of money was needed. Peter the Great did not provide the funds, presumably because there were more pressing matters in the state than the revival of a dilapidated structure that the new order of Russian life had long since condemned to destruction. In 1737, a new disaster struck the Kremlin. A terrible fire devastated Moscow, causing significant damage to the Kremlin palace. During this fire, almost the entire archive, which was located in the building of the Great Palace, was burned. 44 cabinets containing sorted and non-sorted files from previous years were burned down. Cadastre, inventory revision, boundary, and other books from 1571 to 1700 were lost. Thus, the most valuable Russian archives of the 16th and 17th centuries burned down, conveniently for Romanov historians. The Romanovs were so annoyed by ancient Russian traditions and memories of the former empire that they kept the Moscow Kremlin in a state of neglect until the beginning of the 19th century. It got to the point that in the early 19th century, the Romanov administration effectively handed over the Kremlin to the control of thieves and fraudsters. Criminal dens and houses of prostitution emerged in the Kremlin. Kremlin old-timers recounted that until 1812, it was scary to even go to the Kremlin cathedrals, especially in the evening. In the early 19th century, the Romanovs decided to restore the Moscow Kremlin. The restoration work was entrusted to Pyotr Valuev. In 1801, Emperor Alexander I appointed him as the supreme commander of the Kremlin expedition and the armory chamber. The Romanovs chose Valuev for this job not by chance, as they were well aware of his dislike for Russia's past. Inspired by the silent support of the Romanov court, Valuev began a systematic destruction of the surviving remnants of ancient Russian history. He began by demolishing the Sretenka Cathedral and the Armorial Tower in the Kremlin. Then in 1803, part of the amusement palace and part of the building which housed the Klebeny, bread, and food palaces were destroyed. In 1806, the Tsar Boris Godunov Palace was sold at auction. In 1807, the Trinity Conventual Church with the Church of the Epiphany, where the election of Mikhail Romanov as Tsar was announced, was demolished. And in 1808, all the buildings of the rear courtyard of the royal palace with the food, bread, and satiety palaces were demolished. In their place, an armory chamber and 3 cavalry corps were built. As a result of these changes, the Moscow Kremlin lost many ancient buildings. The remaining buildings, the Palace of Facets, the Tarim Palace with its upper churches, and the Amusement Palace were significantly restructured. 10 years later, the Kremlin could no longer be recognized. In its historical form, the Moscow Kremlin did not correspond to Valuyev's architectural tastes. If it were up to him, he would have demolished it altogether, leaving only those buildings that, in his opinion, had a neat appearance or were capable of taking on such an appearance after plastering and painting.
It is well known that the Ascension Convent was located in the Kremlin. It was an Orthodox nunnery where the tombs of both common and noble nuns were located. Later, these tombs were declared the burials and tombs of Russian horde queens of the pre-Peter era. In the 20th century, the convent was destroyed, and the tombs were transferred into an annex of the Archangel Cathedral. And today, supposedly, we can see there the authentic burials of Russian horde queens from the old era, the pre-Romanov era. In reality, this is an outright forgery. The names of supposedly grand Russian queens, such as Sofia Palaeologina, were scratched with nails onto simple modest graves made of plaster and old plastered stone blocks. All of this needs a complete revision, and it is a vivid example of how the Romanovs and their historians falsified Russian history.
Today, taking photos and videos of the so-called tombs of Russian queens is prohibited. You cannot even simply take a look at the burials, because you can only enter the annex of the Archangel Cathedral with special permission, which is granted to a very narrow circle of people. Neither tourists nor our film crew were allowed in. We once again saw how securely historians guard the Romanov secrets. Destruction similar to that which the Romanovs committed in Moscow churches occurred in other Russian cities as well. And some ancient cathedrals were even blown up, after which new churches were built supposedly in the spirit of the old ones. In reality, the Romanovs simply destroyed the history of the great empire, replacing it with fiction. If ancient artifacts stood in the way of implementing this fiction, not only paper and ink were used, but also barrels of gunpowder. This is the Holy Trinity Ipatiev male monastery in Kostroma. Before the 17th century, the monastery was the patrimony of the Godunovs, and after the time of troubles, the Romanovs made it a holy place for their dynasty. This is the main temple of the Ipatiev Monastery, the Trinity Cathedral, which was built in the 17th century, already during the time of the Romanovs. Before the 17th century, another Trinity Cathedral stood in its place, built during the time of the previous Russian Empire. About 60 people from the Godunov family were buried in the old church. However, in the 17th century, the old Trinity Cathedral accidentally exploded, and only a few sarcophagi and gravestones survived. Some of them bear the names of the deceased. No one knows for sure why the old Trinity Cathedral exploded. Historians explain this by saying that gunpowder was allegedly stored in its basement for a long time. Local tour guides cannot explain why the monks stuffed the basement with gunpowder, so they habitually blame the Godunovs. The fact that the cathedral exploded during the Romanovs' time is purely coincidental. In general, one should not dig into the past, as the truth cannot be uncovered. Interestingly, the official museum guide of the Ipatiev Monastery's burial vault of the Godunov Boyars in Kostroma tells a different story about the cathedral's explosion. According to it, in the mid-17th century, the Trinity Cathedral was rebuilt and significantly expanded in size. Instead of the word exploded, historians evasively wrote rebuilt. Here, at the Ipatiev Monastery, we again encounter the boundary that separates the Romanov history from the ancient history of the Great Empire. This boundary is the era of the 17th century, when a powerful wave of remaking history swept through occupied Russia with a total cleansing of all traces. But the destruction of ancient Russian monuments continued even after the 17th century.
The oldest church in Moscow, located on Red Square and beloved by Muscovites, was destroyed in one night. In the 18th century, by order of the Moscow Governor-General, it was dismantled, destroyed, and buried. The pit was leveled in one night because the people simply did not allow it to be done. Ivan the Terrible's palace on the Sparrow Hills, where the Moscow University is now located, was also destroyed in the 18th century.
It is not surprising that after these destructions many foreign tourists are surprised by how few traces of even recent past are left in Russia. Some people analyze the reasons, while others simply conclude that there was simply nothing worthy here. Not like in ancient Western Europe. One of the ancient Russian monasteries is located in Mozhaizhsk, the nativity of the Theotokos Luzhetsky Monastery. It was founded in 1408 by Saint Therapont at the request of Andrei Dmitrievich Mozhaizhsky, son of Grand Duke Dmitry Donskoy. During the time of troubles, the monastery, like the entire city, was subjected to constant devastation. Gradually, thanks to donations, the Luzhetsky Monastery began to be restored. In the 1620s, the Transfiguration Church appeared in the monastery. A stone two-story cell building was built. In 1692, the monastery was decorated with a tent-shaped four-tiered bell tower. The fact that there was a lot of building activity in the Luzhetsky Monastery in the 17th century is evidenced by the results of archaeological excavations carried out in the monastery in 1999 and 2000. When builders removed 2-meter layers of earth throughout the monastery's territory, it became apparent that old tombstones taken from Russian cemeteries were bricked into the foundations of the 17th century buildings. There were a lot of tombstones used as building stones. It seemed that they were brought here from all the surrounding cemeteries. Interestingly, all these ancient tombstones, as a rule, do not resemble those that are presented to us today as supposedly antique Russian samples. Most of the slabs depict a three-pointed forked cross. We saw the same crosses on the tombstones of the Godunovs in the Ipatiev Monastery. After the top layer of soil was removed from the northern wall of the main monastery cathedral of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the foundation of a small church built in the 17th century, more precisely after 1669, was revealed. The builders laid into the foundation not only old tombstones from the 16th century but also from the 17th century. There is a slab dated 7177, which is 1669 AD. Therefore, the foundation was laid after 1669 since this slab was already bricked into it. Interestingly, on the plaques indicating the dates of the Romanov era, the inscriptions and patterns are executed with the same high quality. The letters and patterns are deeply and beautifully carved into the stone, indicating the work of a professional carver. However, the plaques dated to the 16th century have a completely different appearance. While the pattern on the plaque is executed perfectly, the inscription is scratched haphazardly, as if with a simple nail. It is evident that the quality of the inscription is significantly lower than that of the pattern, even though they are on the same plaque. It is likely that all the tombstones dated to the 16th century are fake. It is possible that the old inscriptions were completely removed and new ones were scratched in their place. However, even after such a cleansing, the mute stones still looked incorrect to the Romanov historians with their wrong appearance. Therefore, they did not allow them to peacefully lie in cemeteries, but they were laid in foundations, away from human eyes. And yet these slabs, one might say, were lucky. They became the foundation of the temple. Some tombstones were treated differently.
For example, the famous Kirillo-Belozersky Monastery. Today, visitors to the monastery can walk to the main cathedral on a remarkable road paved with old stone slabs that, according to guides, were taken from the destroyed cemetery of the monastery dating back to the 15th and 16th centuries. The slabs were brutally removed, the burials destroyed and devastated, and the slabs in a disrespectful and mocking manner were laid in a road going along the buildings of the monastery to the main cathedral.
At the end of the 17th century, after the reform of religious customs, new tombstones of the Romanov type began to be installed on Russian cemeteries, which were completely different from the previous ones. And then they pretended it had always been that way. The story of the introduction of European customs to Russia during the era of Peter the Great is well known to everyone. Literary novels and movies have formed a stable image of the reforming Tsar who fought against the so-called vestiges of the past. However, it was not Peter who began the fight against the ancient Russian way of life. His predecessors, the Romanovs, were already doing so. For example, regarding clothing, Peter's brother, Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich Romanov, abolished the old Russian costume and introduced a foreign one, mainly Polish. But it was not enough for Peter to simply dress the Russians in European kaftans. He decided to change even the appearance of Russian people, ordering all men to shave their faces clean, with the exception of those in spiritual orders. Among the boyars, beards were only allowed to be worn by the most noble, such as Boyar Tikhon Streshnev and Prince Mikhail Cherkassky. All other stubborn bearded men were ordered to be caught on the streets and have their beards forcibly cut off. The Romanov reforms also affected other aspects of Russian life. Today, one of the differences between European cathedrals and Russian Orthodox churches are the organs. The word organ refers to a pneumatic musical instrument with a bellows, in which metal pipes sound under the influence of air pressure. The prototype of the organ was most likely the bagpipe. It is believed that there were never any organs in Russian churches. However, this established opinion is most likely incorrect. Foreigners visiting Russia were surprised to discover original organs in many homes, which were inexplicably hidden in cabinets. The reason was that Peter the Great stubbornly eradicated organs. His contemporaries noted that he took great pleasure in a cappella singing, i.e. singing without instrumental accompaniment. Therefore, both organs and harmonicas were forced out of official Russian musical culture. In addition, organs reminded people of the old Russian Empire. As a result, Peter's fashion sense and personal taste had their effect. Since the foundation of St. Petersburg, the number of organists sharply decreased. In 1701, the old, excellently functioning workshop for the production of organs and harpsichords was destroyed in the Moscow fire. It was not rebuilt, and in Moscow, the last celebration using 27 organs was the wedding of the jester Shansky. By the way, in Russia, the accordion and bayan are still widely used. It is believed that the history of these musical instruments can only be traced back to the beginning of the 19th century. However, it is absolutely obvious that both the accordion and the organ are constructed on the same principle. The bellows pump air through the valves or pipes of the instrument, resulting in sounds of different tones. Perhaps the accordion and the organ are two versions of the same instrument. The only difference is that large organs were installed in large buildings, such as churches, while small accordions could be carried around. For 300 years, Romanov historians made great efforts to convince us that the musical culture of ancient Russia, like all Russian culture during the pre-Romanov period, was at a low, almost rudimentary level. In other words, it simply did not exist. Folk songs, pipes, and drums. Can this be compared to the refined musicians of Versailles? However, in 1711, a book by the Dutch traveller Cornelis de Bruijn, Voyage over Muscovy to Persia and India, was published in Amsterdam. This work was translated into almost all European languages. In his book, de Bruijn wrote that in Moscow, he heard music literally at every step. Oboists, horn players, and timpanists in military formation. Whole orchestras of the most diverse instruments, including the organ at the Triumphal Gate. Few people know another interesting fact, that composer Antonio Vivaldi was supposed to move to Moscow for permanent work. However, the trip did not take place, and his students came to Moscow instead. One of them was the violinist and composer Giovanni Vericai. Certainly, these remarkable musicians were not heading to a wild country, but to a country with a highly developed musical culture, where there were organs, large instrumental orchestras, their own excellent musicians, and masters who created excellent musical instruments. But, as it is known, the imposition of new customs affected not only everyday life or musical culture but also architecture.
Today we are told that the church we see, built in the Greek style, is supposedly an old Russian style dating back to the 10th–12th centuries. This is not true. Apparently, the old Russian architectural style of cathedrals and churches is familiar to us today from surviving churches in Western Europe, which are called Gothic or, as we understand it, Goths churches. In fact, such churches existed throughout the empire from the 14th to the early 17th centuries. Then the Romanovs changed the style and introduced a new style in the 17th–18th centuries, which they declared to be very old. Old Russian cathedrals built in the Gothic style were destroyed, smashed, and blown up. Something remained. For example, some cathedrals in the city of Uglich or Yaroslavl still retain the style of a Gothic cathedral, which, as we now well understand, did not come to us from Western Europe, but the other way around. Western Europe is a trace memory of the old horde architecture that once reigned throughout the entire Mongol Empire.
Thus, after their ascension to the Russian throne, The Romanovs eradicated all evidence of the existence of the great empire that stretched to all corners of the known world. Naturally, the greatest threat to the Romanovs were the written sources. They reflected everything, both the true history of the Russian state and their place in this state. As is known, in medieval Russia, there was a special order of appointment to higher government positions based on the ancestry and hierarchical position of ancestors in the grand princes and czar service. This order was called Mestnichestvo. All appointments to government positions were based on this hierarchy and recorded in special category books, Razryad books, which preserved the history of state appointments in Russia in the 15th–16th centuries. This order existed until the last year of Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich Romanov's reign. But on January 12, 1682, the Romanovs dealt another blow to the noble boyars and abolished the system of Mestnichestvo in Russia. Immediately after that, the old Razryad books were destroyed and new ones were compiled, which were supposed to cover practically all layers of service people of that time. The work of compiling genealogical register was entrusted to a specially formed genealogical commission, which received the name Chamber of Pedigree Affairs. 2 genealogical register books were compiled. One of them is known as the Velvet Book. The other has not been found to this day. At the end of the 19th century, the famous Russian historian Nikolai Petrovich Likhachev studied the Velvet Book. He first raised the question of so-called composite lineage. Likhachev discovered that the individuals listed in these genealogies were usually borrowed from available written sources by the compiler, and then grouped into generations, with some names even being entirely made up. For example, the Golovkin's genealogy was compiled in this way. To prove the authenticity of the fabricated genealogies, extensive falsification of ancient records was widely carried out, especially since their authenticity was not being verified by anyone. As many researchers have established, no documentary verification of genealogies was ever conducted in the Chamber of Pedigree Affairs. Nikolai Petrovich Likhachev paid special attention to identifying and criticizing the falsified acts submitted to the Chamber of Pedigree Affairs along with genealogies. He considered the acts of the Izmailovs, Bedovs, Protasievs, and Chadaevs to be fraudulent. Another Russian historian, Stepan Borisovich Vasilovsky, who studied the Romanovs' genealogies, believed that most of them were not based on accumulated genealogical materials passed down from generation to generation, but were fabricated retrospectively. In other words, most of the genealogies of the Romanov nobility were invented in the late 17th century.
It should be noted that not only the genealogies of the Romanov nobility were falsified, but first and foremost, the genealogies of the Romanovs themselves were also falsified, because during the reign of Mikhail Fyodorovich, when the Romanov dynasty came to power, Russian books of Moscow printing, in church books, in publishers' imprint, that is, in official sources, it was asserted that Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich and the grandson of Ivan Vasilievich. This was directly asserted. This was a forgery of the new dynasty's royal genealogy, a direct forgery. They started with this, with such a forgery.
If the Romanovs were not afraid to lie to even their contemporaries who knew their true genealogy, then what can be said about their descendants? All of this was done in the interests of the Romanovs themselves and their entourage. In the former empire, they were at the bottom of the parochial hierarchy. The truth about their origins was recorded in old Razryad books. It is not surprising that after the Romanovs seized power, these books were destroyed. For centuries, Romanov historians engaged in the destruction and falsification of documents, because for the Romanovs themselves, falsifying history was a matter of life and death. They had to hold on to power at all costs. Otherwise they would not have been able to avoid retribution. And for this, they resorted to any measures. It is known that until the end of the 17th century, in Moscow there was the Book of Degrees of the Royal Genealogy, known as Stepanaya Book, compiled at the initiative of the priest of Ivan the Terrible, Metropolitan Macarius of Moscow, in 1560 to 1563. The book contained a narrative of Russian history from the first Russian princes to the time of Ivan Vasilievich. It can be said that this was a grand portrait gallery of Russian rulers of the Rurik dynasty. In the 16th–17th centuries, the Stepanaya book was one of the most popular historical works. At that time, it had a great influence on various spheres of societal life, even on monumental wall painting of those years. For example, under its influence, the painting of the Archangel Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin was created. By the way, it was completely justifiably stated in this book that the Rurik dynasty descended from the Roman Emperor Augustus. However, during the reign of Alexei Mikhailovich, the Stepanaya book, which was kept in the recording department, aka Zapasnoy Prikaz, mysteriously disappeared. Therefore, the Romanovs had to compile a new Stepanaya book. In 1672, the Great State Book or Root of the Russian Sovereigns, often called the Book of Titles, was compiled in the Ambassadorial Prikaz, which was Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time. This book contained portrait images of Kiev and Moscow princes and czars from Rurik to Alexei Mikhailovich in chronological order. Since the Stepanaya book of the Rurik dynasty disappeared, the writers of the Ambassadorial Prikaz could easily compose the Book of Titles in the spirit that was pleasing to the new Romanov dynasty. Another interesting book describes the genealogy of Russian rulers, which was published in Moscow almost simultaneously with the Book of Titles. This work was written by Lavrenti Hrelich, who visited Moscow in 1656 as part of the embassy of the Austrian Emperor Leopold I. And in 1673, Hrelich wrote the book, Genealogy of the Most Holy and Noble Grand Dukes of Moscow, also known as the Genealogy. Using genealogical tables, Hrelich attempted to establish the place of Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov among other European monarchs. In 1674, Hrelich sent his book to Moscow, which was recorded in the documents of the Ambassadorial Prikaz. Why did Hrelich decide to describe the genealogy of Russian rulers, and why did he think that his work would be of interest to the Russian Tsar? It seems that the Austrian diplomat compiled some new genealogy of Russian princes and czars and sent it to Alexei Romanov as an instruction on the new, correct Russian history. It is possible that all representatives of the new royal dynasty were later required to follow this instruction. However, despite the efforts of the Romanovs, not everyone initially believed in their royal ancestry.
In the first half of the 17th century, certain books began to be published in Poland, the content of which we do not know today, but apparently they were interesting books that did not call the Romanov boyars czars, but leaders or in some other way. They described their origin in a different way. So the Romanovs sent a whole delegation to Poland with the following demand: to burn all the books, to execute all the typesetters, to execute all the owners of the areas where these books were published, and, in general, to execute all the people who were related to these books and could know their contents. This demand was made by the Romanovs to the Polish king after several books were published in Poland that spoke about the Romanovs in a different light than we are used to.
It is not known for certain how the Polish king reacted to this demand. However, it is known that in 17th-century Europe, chronicles were published in which nothing was said about the Romanovs at all. For example, Wilhelm Stratemann's well-known work Theatrum Historicum, published in 1680, described all the events known at that time in world history. It contains several facts from Russian history, including the 17th century. But there is not a single mention of the Romanov Tsars.
There is a mention of Ivan the Terrible, but nothing about the Romanovs.
If the Romanovs really had an ancient dynasty, they would have been mentioned in the chronicles of that time. Romanov historians falsified not only Razryad books, chronicles, and state documents from the era of the former Great Empire. Geographical maps also contained a vast amount of information about the country they destroyed.
Unfortunately, today few people know about the outstanding Russian cartographer of the 18th century, Ivan Kirillovich Kirillov.
In 1727, he became a chief secretary of the Senate and a secretary of the Commission on Commerce. He was knowledgeable in geography, mathematics, physics, history, and astronomy. In the state chancellery he was listed as an expert in topographical surveying of the earth. Therefore, when Peter the Great decided to create a geographic atlas of his possessions, Kirillov was appointed responsible for this enterprise.
He planned to publish a series of detailed maps.
The complete work consisted of 3 volumes, with 120 maps each, including a general map of the country. But the Imperial Academy decided to prohibit Kirillov's atlas. As a result, 360 excellent geographic maps were destroyed. Even the printing plates were destroyed. In the end, only 2 copies of Ivan Kirillov's atlas were registered, one of which had defects. Separate sheets printed from the original plates are extremely rare to find today. Modern researchers say that from 1726 until his death in 1737, Kirillov managed to print and prepare for printing 37 maps, 28 of which have survived to this day. As for the 360 maps of the unpublished atlas, they are mentioned almost in passing, and not a word is said about the fact that these maps were destroyed. Today you can see several supposedly surviving maps from this atlas, but their authenticity is in doubt. For example, the general map of the Russian Empire, allegedly released in St. Petersburg in 1734. The fact that Moscow Tartary, the largest state of the time, is completely absent from the map suggests that it is likely a forgery. Could a master like Ivan Kirillov know nothing about it? Certainly, one could assume that by 1734 Moscow Tartary had ceased to exist as an independent state, so it is not on the map. But here is a map made by cartographers of the British Encyclopedia in 1771, 37 years after the appearance of the map attributed to Kirillov. Here, Moscow Tartary is depicted very clearly. Another strange moment is that all the names on Kirillov's map are written in Latin. Only explanatory inscriptions in the upper left and lower left corners are in Russian. One could assume that at that time it was customary to draw up geographical maps in this way, to do everything in the Western style. But here is a map created at approximately the same time by the Russian cartographer Vasily Kiprianov. This world map was created personally for Peter the Great, but all the inscriptions on it are in Russian. It is unlikely that the Russian cartographer Ivan Kirillov made Latin inscriptions on his general map of the Russian Empire. Most likely, his authentic map was made in Russian. But the Romanov falsifiers destroyed it, as well as most of Kirillov's maps.
And then they simply took some suitable from their point of view foreign map of Russia and attributed it to the famous cartographer.
So what was wrong with the maps of Ivan Kirillov, one of the best specialists of his time, according to the Imperial Academy of Sciences? According to the official version, Kirillov's geographic atlas was not accurate and precise enough, so it took 11 more years to work on a new atlas. But most likely, the reason was different.
Kirillov's maps simply hindered the Romanovs from promoting their new version of Russian history.
It is likely that these maps clearly included Moscow Tartary, which until the end of the war with Pugachev was not only an independent but also a hostile state for the Romanovs. Romanov historians removed all mentions of it from any documents that fell into their hands. And it is clear that the decision to destroy such a unique work as the Atlas of Ivan Kirillov was not made at the Academy of Sciences, but at the highest levels of government. 360 magnificent maps and even printing plates could be destroyed only by the highest order. Fortunately, not all incorrect geographical maps were destroyed. Some of them have been preserved. However, historians prefer not to talk about them and hide them in archival storage and museum reserves. For example, a fragment of a large antique atlas of the Russian Empire, compiled by the outstanding Russian cartographer Semyon Remezov, is no longer exhibited at the Hermitage. Perhaps because many geographical names in this atlas also do not correspond to traditional history.
It is known that during the time of Peter the Great, the attitude towards this map was very skeptical. Peter the Great liked to invite guests to the map that hung on the wall of his palace and showed it as a curiosity, demonstrating how ignorant Russian czars were, who filled the large map with strange and ridiculous names. As we understand, there was nothing ridiculous in these names. These were ancient Russian names that were later erased by Romanov historians and cartographers from the map of the Russian Empire.
In 1613, the Romanovs who came to power did everything possible to justify their right to the Russian throne and prevent a return to the old imperial orders.
Throughout their reign, they corrected and rewrote Russian history.
This was done not only in the interests of the Romanovs themselves, but also in the interests of other new states that appeared on the world map after the collapse of the Great Russian Empire. These were the European countries that were primarily interested in writing a new version of history. In 1917, the era of the Romanovs' rule tragically came to an end. The last Tsar, Nicholas II, was probably the most Russian of this pro-Western dynasty, despite having almost no Russian blood. Perhaps it was the very life of Russia, its vast expanses, its people, and its culture that assimilated the Romanovs and still forced them to build a powerful Russian state. One could say that the mutation of the Russian Tsars of the Romanov dynasty began with Peter the Great. It was he who restored Russia's status as an empire and reintroduced the title of emperor. In his will, Peter the Great wrote about the need to restore a world empire. Many Russian and European historians studied and described Russia's past. Each of them had their own attitude towards Russia and its history. Each gave their own assessment of the Russian state and its rulers. Why some historians were forgotten, while others became official historians of the country, you can see in our next film how Russian history was written.